We started this paragraph yesterday on page Hey, on the left column towards the bottom, called She'ela V'toch Kedei Dibur. And we got up to line 3. He says, Kosva Achronim, Shemhemer Karma V'chazer B'toch Kedei Dibur. And we were wondering whether or not this is a tos. He's Megala Daito that he made a mistake. And there's no such thing as tos to undermine the chalos tmura, or perhaps he's removing his very statement. We give him another few seconds after he completes his statement to rescind and retract his statement. Im chazer bo legamre ulefi chazaroso eno ose tmura klal eno yochel lachzer bo. This is like counterintuitive. He's saying that if he wants to make a complete chazara, he's not just shifting from a carbon shlamim to a carbon ola and so forth. So on. He really just wants to rescind the whole. It was a bad idea. In such a case, he cannot be choser. In other words, you basically don't have the power and the right to be choser. You got to leave something for hegdesh, so to speak. You can't leave hegdesh in the lurch. I say in the lurch. And empty-handed. Now he wants to be chosbo legamri. You don't have the rights to do so. Meaning, they're not learning that it's a question of rescinding his original statement, his declaration, as if he never made that declaration. In Eidus, for example, this halacha of Toch Kedei Dibur, which means that I can remove my statement, the statement that I made in front of the court, I can now rescind it. But we're not learning like that here in Hegdish. But Aval, he says, if Eno Choser Rakmi Mina Carbon Chehemer, he's allowing Hegdesh to get something. He's, it's like, you're feeding, again, you're not feeding the best fish to the seal, but you're getting him something to eat. Akam Lefi Chazaros Adayin Hu Osa Tmur Kigon Chehemer Ola V'Chozer Bo Behemer Shlamim. Then, at least according to one sheet, the Mo'ila Chazaros, he can literally change the nature, the track, so to speak, the channel of his tmura from channel A to channel B. It's no longer ola, but now it's shlamim. But he does recognize the tmura. He's only shifting and changing the details of the tmura. And the chalos kodshim, or the chalos zevach, that relates to that Behemas Chulin, upon which he did his Ma'aseh Tmura. And where is this Tzadik Ches? Here again, I have that problem. Let me just see. Oh, if I turn this over, he says the following. Wow, so this is really something. We haven't encountered a Ktsos in Kodshim. Ktsos Kasab, Shalomo Ila Chazora, Toch Kedei Dibur B'chol Ha'ofan. So it doesn't matter. Even if you're shifting from Ola to Shlomim, that's a Chazara, and you don't have the right to be Choser. You cannot disqualify the Tmura that you already enunciated. And by the way, it makes sense. The Ktsos HaChosh makes a lot of sense. We'll soon see the Nesivus, he's going to disagree, but I think the ball is in the Nesivus court to explain this difference, because what we're saying is that once you made that declaration of Behemazu, Chalipin or Furazu, then that Behema became endowed with the status of Kodshe Tmura. Now, you want to take it away and change that kedusha. How can you do so? But Nesivas HaMishpat Nokat Sherakim Chosbo Legamri Min HaTmur Lo Moyel Chazav Yochel L'Shanos B'Toch Kedei Dibur May Ola L'Shlom. Yeah, but he doesn't explain. Ba'Fike Yam Kosav Shechazor B'Toch Kedei Dibur B'Tmura Shnuya Machlok Sabay V'Rav. Okay, that's already a sugya. Let's just see if we can give some explanation to the Nesivas. The Nitzivitz is holding that there are two parts to Tmura, the two dimensions to Tmura. One is the creation of Hegdesh, of a Zevach, by transforming Chulin into Hegdesh, taking Behemoth's Chulin and making it into a Zevach that has to be brought on the mistake. That's one dimension. The second dimension is the Chal Shem Karban, Chal Shem Zevach, the specific classification and definition of the Zevach. And the Nesiva says that as far as the din of Chazara is concerned, there's no Chazara on A, but there can be Chazara on B. You can't be Chosebo and rescind the very entity and enterprise of Tmura to turn and convert this Behemas Chulin into Behemas Kodshim that has to be brought on the Mizbeh. But when we get to the second dimension of Tmura, and that reflects on the relationship between the Behemas Kodshim and the Behemas Chulin, in which case the Behemas Chulin becomes a clone of the Behemas Kodshim with all those dinim and the nuances of halachas that reflect on that particular classification of the carbon, that already you can be choseba. And you can shift the Tmura vis-a-vis this Behemas Chulin from Ola to Shlomim. You have to have two animals in front of you, one is Ola and one is Shlomim. Again, honestly, I think the Ktsos is a lot easier to understand. If there's no Chazara, then the very moment that you made this declaration and the words came out of your mouth, it had its impact. We can quote a pasuk in Koheles, right? Ma'uvas lo yuchal liskar, right? That it's irretractable. You can't change the implication of your action. Whenever I mention the Ktsos, I have an emotional high. I'll tell you why. I read a little bit of the biography of the Ktsos. The man was unbelievably poor. During the cold winters, the ink that he used to write his work, his magnum opus, the Ktsos, would freeze over. He had no heat whatsoever. And the only way he was able to write the Ktsos was he would cover the ink and write as he was covered over a blanket. Now, that's just an introduction to the following story. The Ktsos was not the first giant to write a commentary on Choshen Mishpat. He was predated by Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, who had written a work on Choshen Mishpat, which became extremely popular. When the Ktsos finished the writing of his commentary on the Choshen Mishpat, he needed desperately a haskam. First of all, because in general, you couldn't publish a sefer if you were not well known. He was at that time not an unknown, unless you had haskam from one of the Gedolim. But secondly, he needed a haskama desperately for this sefer, the Ktsos, because he was not the trailblazer, and there was already a popularized commentary on Choshen Mishpat. So he came to a Rav. Again, the details I have, but I don't have it here at my fingertips, the name of the Rav and the community that he went to. And he got an audience with that Rav, and he showed him the Kisvei Yad, the manuscript that he had written. So the Rav asked him, and what's the theme, what's the subject of this work that you want to haskam? You want me to write an approbation, a letter of haskam? He said it's a commentary on the Choshen Mishpat. So immediately the Rav said, but we have a commentary on the Kodshim. But since you made this trip, leave the manuscript with me and I'll look it over. So the Ktsos went back to his inn, wherever he was staying, and he was despondent because that comment of the Rav indicated to him that he doesn't have a shot at it. The Rav was just being nice, and instead of sending him right back and saying, no, immediately, I'm not even going to look at your manuscript, he gave him the courtesy, I'll look it over. So Ktsos was very down, and the following morning, he started packing his bags to leave town. And he figured he'll just pick up the manuscript, and he wouldn't even bother to ask the Rav for a faskom. But what happened was that when he was packing his bags, he heard a bang on his door. And it was the Gabbai. And the Gabbai said, I'm going from door to door because the Rav invited the entire community to Hachnasa Sefer Torah, and he wants everyone to show up at Hachnasa Sefer Torah. So the Ktsos he had no cheshik to go, he was despondent. But if the Rav is asking everyone to show, so for Kavod Rav, he would go to the Sefer Torah. Hachnasa Sefer. Anyway, the Rav was holding on to the mantle of the Sefer, the covering of the Sefer, and he was like in a state of ecstasy, of absolute joy. And then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed the Ktsos, and he called him up to the front, and the Ktsos didn't know what was going on. He came up to the front, and the Rav picked up the mantle. Underneath the mantle was the Ksav Yad, the manuscript of the Ktsos HaChoshim. And I can't tell you how this brings tears to my eyes, this story. Could you imagine the simcha of that Rav when he went through the manuscript, probably stayed up the whole night, and he realized that this deserves at least the Hachnasa Sefer Torah, and the Ktsos had no clue that would happen. And hence we have the Ktsos. One of the most important works in the last probably 2 centuries. We go on. Ola Shlomim Vitoda. A Meimer Karban Ola O Karban Shlomim Hare Behema Satmura Kreva Kikarmanas El. Fine. So Ola and Shlomim are what we call classics. And through Tmura, the Behemas Chulin now takes on all the dinim of an Ola or a Shlomim, which means that it's brought on the Mizbeach as an Ola, which is Kula Kolil, or as a Shlomim. However, Heimer Karban Toda. Now, a Karban Toda is very unique. It's the only Karban that requires an accompaniment of what's called Lachmei Toda, 40 breads, 30 of which are matzah, 10 of which are chametz. Heimer Karban Toda, so he's got a Karban Toda, and now he does a Ma'aseh Tmura onto a Behemas Chulin of the Karban Toda. Ein Tmurasa Kayotze Bo Legamri. The Tmura is not an identical clone to the original Behemas Kodshim, which is a Toda. Toda to Una Lechem, Utmurasa Eina Tmura Lechem. Meaning, when you're chayav in a Toda, right? Abad Tzrichim Lahodos. Let's say you got out of jail or you traversed, a very dangerous wilderness. You're obligated to bring this carbon in order to express your gratitude, Toda, Kishma, that's what it is, to the Ribbono Shalom. You are mafresh a carbon Toda, even though Tmura will be matfis the Kedushas carbon, but the Lechmei Toda that accompany the Toda, there because you are expressing gratitude for God having saved you. But there was no gratitude and no saving in the Tmura. The Tmura was just at Fasas, he was matfis the Kedushas carbon, but not the Lechem. We'll take a look at footnote number Kuf, and he tells you that this is based on a Mishnah and a Gemara in Tmura Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis. And now he invokes the Rambam Shita. Im hoya karban toda, todas chova, rak im hikriv es hatmura, li acher shekvar hikriv todasa, ein te'una tmura lech, ach im hikriv odem shehikriv es todasa, te'una gam lech. Now, the obvious question is going to be, so what do you do with the original carbon toda? I don't know. B'im hoisa hatoda todas nidava te'una tmura lechem bein kodshim todasa bein liachashim. So the Rambam comes up with a fantastical and complicated chidush here that's not in the Gemara, not in the Mishnah. And the Rambam has three cases. And the dinim change based on these three cases. The first scenario is that he was obligated in this carbon toda because he went through the desert, etc. And he hasn't brought his carbon toda yet. He hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Now, the first carbon toda that he's bringing is the Tvura. He hasn't yet brought his carbon, the original carbon chova that he separated and he was magdashid as a carbon toda. So once he brings that carbon that has the status of a carbon toda, he now is fulfilling his chiyuv carbon toda through that animal, which was a behemas chulin that became a carbon toda through the mechanism called a ma'isa tmura. But if he already brought his first carbon, namely the carbon chova, then he will not be bringing the second carbon, meaning the tmura, as a carbon told to fulfill his obligation, but rather because, let's call it in brisker terms, it's a chefta of a carbon toda. But as far as the Gabra is concerned, he has already fulfilled his obligation. He already brought his carbon toda of chova. Then as far as the chefta is concerned, there's no lechem that has to accompany that chefta. It has the status and classification of a carbon toda, and all the dinim of carbon toda will apply, but it's not for a fulfillment of his personal obligation. He's already fulfilled that personal obligation with the first carbon, which was designated as a carbon toda. Again, I would wonder if he brought the Tvura first, accompanied by Lechem, I wonder what happens to the first animal. That's a question unto itself. I mean, maybe the Rambam addresses that, which I know we could open up Suya with Kodshim. Now we have the third scenario of a Todas Nidava. In a case of a Todas Nidava, the Rambam comes up with an amazing chiddush that the Tvura requires lechem. And it's irrelevant as to whether or not he already brought the Toda of Rishus, meaning of Nidava, or he has to get brought to Nidava. Let's just take a minute to try to construct some sort of mechanism to understand the Rambam. The lechem that accompanies a carbon chova, todas chova, is generated by the experience and the salvation that he experienced. But in the case of a carbon nidava, of a todas nidava, he's like borrowing the kedushas carbon from a toda. Instead of being magdish as an ol or as a shlam, he was magdish as a toda, but it was purely voluntary on his behalf. It was a carbon nidava. So that now whatever dinim were included in his nidava, he took upon himself a pledge to bring a carbon toda. Whatever is required in the context of the carbon toda has to be brought because of his neder, not because he was yored midbaris, because he went down to the desert. So now when he brings a Tvura of a Todas Nedava, that Tmura will have to be accompanied by Lech, but not because of a Kiyum of Lechem, but rather because that's the name of the carbon. And that's what's generated by the Tmura. Perhaps that's what the Ram. And what do we say? It was Psulei Mikdashim Yud Beis Ches. Okay, let me just see. Yud Beis. Anything here? A mafresh Todaso. Okay, fine. And that's a different discussion. Oh. Now he's talking about Tmuras Toda. And now of them. 1 second, what got lost here? Well, maybe that's a different case in the Ram. This is the key punchline in the Ram. No, it's even after he did the Tmura, he has not yet brought the original carbon told that he was Mafresh Magdish. Rehiva Khalifasa, again, he's referring to the Tmura. Shteim Tzrichos Lechem. And he have to accompany the original Toda and the Tmuras Toda with Lechem. Medvar Mamurim. We know their Toda. Aval Todas Nidava. I'm not sure what those words. We know their Toda. I don't know. It's a Chova. Aval Todas Nidava. Khalifasa. To Uno Lechem. Bein lifnei kapar, bein liach. So it's interesting. My question is not a question, then. The Rambam holds that whenever you have to bring the Toda, you have to bring the Tmuras Toda as a carbon, and it has to be accompanied by Lechem. And now we have two scenarios that fit that bill. Number one, in a case of a Todas Choma, but he has not yet brought his Toda. And number two, in a case of carbon Todas Nedava, even if he already brought his Toda, then both the original carbon and the Tmura carbon require Lechem. Because I was asking, what do you do with the original one? But the Rambam is clear that you bring the original one as well. And it's very interesting because in a case of the Nedava, so I can add another Nedava. I put one carbon, Toda as a Nedava, now bring another one, I can add infinitum. But in case of a Todas Chova, how does the Rambam allow you to bring two carbonos for the same identical chova? That's what I can't fathom. Because he writes, Imadayin lo keeper ba, he's talking now in the Reisha about Todas Chova, but he hasn't yet brought it. He v'chalifasa, he utmurasa omdos, Shteim Tzrichos Lechem. Shteim Tzrichos Lechem means he's bringing both carbonos. And yet he's talking about a Todas Chova. Very strange. It sort of undermines one of my premises in Kodshim that you can't bring two carbonos for the same identical chova.
I mean, so is there stuff like there is something you build it?
Maybe your guess is as good as mine. The Ram doesn't say anything about suffering. I don't think the Ram is operating with something, saying that the Tmura in this case, it's Chal, the Shlemusa, including the Lechem that has to accompany them. So that was page 5. Okay? Page 8. Let's see if I have here page. Chatos v'yoshim. Tmuras korban chatos hi b'chlal chamesh chatos hamesos v'dino lemiso. Tmuras korban oshim hi b'chlal hashamo shedinom l'raya. Yira yishis tov yipol b'mumi yipol dom l'ntom. He doesn't give you any explanation. It just tells you to look at the Mishnah. So we'll have to take it at face value. I think this is what's called halacha l'moshe miSinai, which is called chamesh chatos hamesos. One of which is tmuras chatos. Now, normally, if an animal of hegdesh, lemizbeach, kedushas haguf becomes disqualified, it becomes posel lemizbeach, then we have a mechanism called yira ad sheyistayir. We let the animal go out into the grazing area, and I don't know if we deliberately put some nails out there and he eats a nail, the animal eats a nail, or maybe we assume that it's going to eat something that's going to create a mum. And then once the animal becomes a bal mum, we can do what's called a pigeon. And then the monies of that pigeon will be earmarked to buy a replacement korban. So that's called Yira Ad Sheyistayir. The word Yira with an ayin, Yud Reish Ayin Hey, means let it go at pasture like a shepherd. Go ahead. Now, for some unknown reason, a korban osham does not lend itself to a full-fledged tmura. So I have a korban osham, and I have a beimas chulin, and I say harezu chalufa lezu, or harezu tmura zu. The status of the behemas chulin now is that through the tmura it becomes a korban osham, but an osham that cannot be brought on the mizbeach. And that makes this tmuras osham into what we call psulei hamikdash. It's disqualified, even though it's hegdesh, it's disqualified from the mizbeach, and in such a case, we apply the principle of yireh ad sheyistayir. In the case of korban chatos, the halacha l'moshe miSinai goes a step further and tells me that there's no salvaging this animal. It's completely gone. And that's called Hamesh Chatos Mesos. There are 5 categories in Kodshim that hopefully we'll get up to. We're only up to one of them, where the Chatos becomes disqualified, and as a result, Misa. We don't actively kill it, but we lock it up in such a way that it's going to die. And we have now halacha l'moshe miSinai about tmuras chatos, that it's one of those 5 categories of chatos hamesos. There's no yira ad sheyistayir. So basically, tmuras osham comes under the category of psulei hamikdashim, and therefore yira ad sheyistayir. Whereas chatos, in a case of tmura, is mesos. It's not a balas mum. It's completely gone. Then we get to Bechar, Maser, Upesach. Tmuras Bechar Maser Eina Kreva. Elamamtin at sheyipol bo mum. V'teochel b'muma Kidin b'char u'maseh shehu. All right, so this will have to, this I think is a more complicated discussion. I think we'll leave this tomorrow. Let's make a note. We got up to Bechor Maser Pesach on page Vav. That's where Mirz Hashem, we would pick it up.